Robert Keene had long since abandoned any need for recognition. Time had stripped away the shine of his medals, the crispness of his uniform, and the attention his name once commanded. These days, he went by Bobby to the few who still remembered, a name softened by years and carried with the quiet weight of a man who had survived more than he ever admitted. On that unremarkable Tuesday morning, he didn't wake with the intention of confronting anyone or reopening old wounds. He had no interest in reliving battles or proving anything. His mission was simple, almost mundane to the outside world: withdraw a few $100s from an old account he hadn't touched in decades. But to Bobby, it was more than a transaction. It was the final step in a quiet promise he had made long ago, one that had nothing to do with glory and everything to do with love. Before stepping out the door, he ran a calloused hand over the black cap he'd laid carefully on the kitchen counter the night before, embroidered in fading gold thread with the words Korea, Vietnam Veteran. The hat was clean, brushed free of lint and dust, not because he expected anyone to notice, but because there were rituals you didn't let go of, no matter how much the world moved on. His shirt was pressed, though the cuffs showed signs of wear, and he moved deliberately as he slipped on a heavy coat that had weathered countless winters. In its inside pocket, folded neatly, were the tattered pieces of a life once defined by duty: 2 aged discharge papers, a worn Veterans Affairs ID, and a brass challenge coin dulled by decades of being carried, not displayed. The coin, engraved with a thunderbird and 7 stars, was a relic of operations no newspaper had ever covered, the kind of object that held meaning only for those who had earned the right to understand it. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, not from weakness, but from time. Time that had turned once steady hands into instruments of memory, marked by frostbitten nights and endless waits in places whose coordinates were never entered into any official record. As he approached the front doors of the Summit Ridge National Bank, there was no air of performance, no stiff military posture or theatrics. Just a man with a quiet purpose and a lifetime folded into the seams of his coat. The bank, with its polished floors and stale fluorescent lighting, felt like any other bureaucratic space he'd endured before: another line, another counter, another name to verify. But for Bobby, the setting didn't matter. He knew how to wait. He had waited for planes in monsoon-drenched jungles, for orders in hostile deserts, and for peace in a country that never quite figured out how to welcome him back. He stepped in, hat in hand, eyes steady but unassuming, taking his place in line without a sound. There was no sign, no marker, that he had once commanded units in places where silence meant survival and a single decision could save or cost lives. No one in the bank recognized the man who had once carried radio silence through gunfire or traced supply lines through enemy territory under orders too secret to document. And Bobby didn't expect them to. What lived in him now wasn't the need for acknowledgement, but a deeply embedded sense of completion. He wasn't just trying to retrieve money. He was reaching into the past to keep a promise, a small, private vow made to help his grandson pay for school, because to Bobby, service didn't end when the uniform came off. It continued in small, unnoticed acts of loyalty. In showing up, in providing, in finishing what you started. As he neared the counter, the coin shifted lightly in his coat pocket, as if it too remembered the weight of its meaning. Bobby didn't know what kind of reception awaited him, but that never stopped him before. And it wouldn't stop him now. The clerk behind the glass partition was young, mid-20s, maybe, a polished badge on her blazer reading Cynthia in tidy white script. She was efficient, clearly trained to maintain a veneer of politeness, but her eyes gave her away. Bobby saw it the moment he handed her his identification. It wasn't the kind of look that screamed hostility. It was more insidious than that. A flicker of hesitation, an almost imperceptible tightening of the jaw, the polite but sharp way her eyebrows lifted when she examined his documents. An entire conversation played out in expressions and pauses. She stared at his ID card a second too long, then turned it over slowly, as though expecting it to reveal something suspicious on its plastic underside. "Mr. Keene, you said this account hasn't been accessed in over 30 years, she asked, voice flat, professional, but touched with something that made Bobby feel like a case file instead of a human being. "That's right," he answered evenly. "It was opened after I came back. VA recommended this bank. Thought it'd be safest to let the money sit." Her fingers tapped the keyboard lightly. There was no warmth in her eyes, only the rehearsed squint of someone trained to doubt. "We'll have to verify the origin of the account and confirm you're the rightful holder. It may take a while. You understand, I'm sure." Bobby nodded, but something in him twitched, some long-buried nerve that hadn't fired in years. The sort of twitch that comes not from impatience, but from recognition. This wasn't just bureaucracy. It was a challenge cloaked in formality. He'd heard the tone before, in different accents, under different flags, in interrogation rooms where civility was just a mask for control. He'd answered questions while bleeding through his uniform. He'd kept his tone calm while men tried to break him with kindness, laced in threat. And now, here he was, decades later, asked to prove himself to a bank teller barely older than the war he'd survived. She asked him to step aside while she consulted with her supervisor. "We'll need to run this through higher-level verification," she said, not offering a seat. Bobby nodded again and stepped away quietly, but inside, something stirred. Not anger, at least not yet, but a kind of sorrow that wrapped itself around his ribs. He stood in the middle of the lobby, staring at his feet as people shuffled past. His hands stayed in his coat pockets, one of them brushing against the smooth, worn surface of the challenge coin. It steadied him. When the manager arrived, a man in a tailored suit with too much cologne and the brisk demeanor of someone who valued efficiency over empathy, things took a turn. "Mr. Keene," he began, voice practiced and just a little too loud. "We've been reviewing your account, and there are some irregularities." Irregularities. Unusual inactivity. No withdrawals or deposits since 1993. And the ID you've provided, while technically valid, is quite old. We'll need more substantial proof of identity, possibly a secondary verification method. You understand. In today's world, we have to take every precaution against fraud. Fraud. There it was. The word hit like a slap, not because it was spoken with malice, but because it was spoken so casually, so thoughtlessly. Bobby had spent most of his life being told what he couldn't do, where he couldn't go, who he wasn't. He had expected red tape. He hadn't expected to be treated like a potential criminal. He looked the manager in the eye then. Not with aggression, but with a piercing steadiness that came from years of reading situations where survival depended on the smallest detail. "I'm not here to steal anything," he said, voice low but clear. "That money is mine. I earned it. And I left it here because I believed it'd be safe." "I'm sure you did," the manager replied, with a kind of condescension that pretends to be understanding. "But times have changed. We need to protect all our clients." Bobby didn't say what he was thinking, that the only thing he'd ever asked to be protected was the right to disappear in peace, to not be questioned anymore, to not have to prove his worth to people who couldn't fathom what it meant to give your life away 1 year at a time in places they couldn't pronounce. Instead, he pulled out a second document, a faded VA benefits letter, brittle at the edges from being folded too many times. Cynthia examined it like it was a foreign artifact, holding it by its corners. The manager sighed, clearly impatient, and began speaking to her in hushed tones that Bobby could still hear. Phrases like "could be a stolen identity case," and "he's probably confused," floated just loud enough to sting. And there, in the middle of the bank he once trusted, Robert Keene was no longer a veteran or a citizen or even a man. He was a suspicion, a file, a problem. He said nothing. He stood straighter, quietly reclaiming the inches of dignity that had been chipped away. His pride wasn't in his voice or his posture, it was in his restraint, in not letting them see how deeply it cut, in refusing to let their disbelief unmake him. Because Bobby Keene had been doubted before, but he had never been broken. Silence, when it came, did not fall like a curtain. It crept in slowly, unnoticed at first, then settled heavily, like fog clinging to an old battlefield long after the gunfire stopped. Bobby stood there unmoving, as if frozen between centuries. The bank lobby around him hummed with quiet modern life, the clicking of keyboards, the soft swish of automatic doors, muffled conversations from other customers oblivious to what was unfolding a few feet away. But for Bobby, the room had emptied of sound. Everything had receded. Even the voices of the manager and the teller became background static, like distant radio chatter during a patrol. He did not respond immediately. He couldn't. Not because he lacked the words, but because the words, if spoken too soon, would have cracked under the weight of everything they were meant to carry. This was not the first time he had been questioned, humiliated, made to feel like a stranger in the very country he had once bled for. But something about this moment carved deeper. Perhaps it was the casualness of the insult, the effortless way it had been delivered by people too young to understand its impact. Or perhaps it was the way they looked at him, not as someone dangerous, but as someone irrelevant. He reached into his coat pocket, slowly, carefully, as if rehearsing the motion not out of caution but out of reverence. His fingers found the challenge coin again. It was smooth and cold, a familiar weight in his palm. He closed his hand around it, his knuckles tightening with invisible tension. The coin wasn't a weapon, but it felt like armor now, proof that somewhere, at some point, his life had meant something. That he wasn't a ghost in this place. Cynthia said something again. He didn't catch the full sentence, but he heard the shape of it. A polite request for further verification, another attempt to sanitize suspicion with soft vowels. He looked at her, finally, and nodded faintly. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. She was doing her job, and her job was to question him. That was the part that stung. There had been a time when wearing a uniform was verification enough. Now, even breathing the wrong way too close to a teller's window could be misread as a threat. Still, Bobby didn't speak. He let the silence stretch, not to intimidate, but to protect himself. Words, once said, couldn't be taken back, and in his world, they carried weight, often more than bullets. He had learned to withhold, to calculate, to measure the risk of speaking versus the damage of staying quiet. And here, in a fluorescent-lit bank in suburban America, that instinct still held. Inside, though, the reaction was building. Not outrage. Not even indignation. It was something quieter, more corrosive grief. A kind of invisible mourning that had no funeral, no flag-draped casket. Grief for the way things had changed. For the trust that had eroded, not just in people, but in systems he once believed were sacred. He had fought for the idea of this country. But the reality standing before him now bore little resemblance to the one he had carried like a compass through the chaos of war. The manager shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that something in the air had turned. He cleared his throat and spoke with a placating tone of someone trying to wrap discomfort in professionalism. "Mr. Keene, if you'd prefer to come back with additional documents, we can expedite the process. We're simply trying to ensure everything is in order." But Bobby still said nothing. He looked down at the documents in his hands, proof of service, years of deferment, benefits earned but rarely used. On the VA letterhead, his name was typed in bold. His rank, his discharge status, the campaigns. All verified. All real. Still not enough. He wanted to speak then. To say something that would cut through the layers of bureaucracy and reach the human beneath the protocol. But what would he even say? That he remembered the smell of diesel and blood more vividly than his last birthday? That he still woke up at 4:47 a.m. without needing an alarm, because that's when the first shells used to land? That when they asked for his name just now, part of him had to remember who he was today, because the man he used to be never came back from the jungle fully. But no. None of that would make sense to them. So he stayed quiet. A few steps away, a child tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing toward Bobby's cap. "What's that mean?" he asked in a whisper, too young to understand the gravity stitched into those words. "Korea, Vietnam veteran." The mother didn't answer, only pulled him gently away, smiling nervously at Bobby in that way people do when they aren't sure whether to acknowledge someone or not. Bobby noticed the gesture, and he smiled back just barely, a tired, worn smile. Because at the core of all this silence, all this reaction, was a single, unshakable truth. He had given everything, and now, when all he asked for was a sliver of what was his, he was being told to prove it again. The bank was still. The moment hung like smoke in the air. The silence did not end with an apology. It ended with protocol, a shift in posture, a glance between employees, a tap of keys behind the counter that wasn't meant to be noticed but was. Something in Cynthia's eyes flickered when she read the updated information on her screen, as if a quiet alarm had gone off, not the blaring kind that demands attention, but the kind that settles deep in the chest, telling you you've made a mistake too late to undo it gracefully. She looked up at Bobby again. This time, she didn't see the lines on his face the same way. They no longer seemed like the slow erosion of age, but something earned, etched by experiences she couldn't begin to understand. A breath hitched in her throat, though she smoothed her voice quickly. "Mr. Keene," she began, but there was something new in her tone. Something tentative. Not yet regret. More like the first rustling of it. Bobby caught it. He was trained to catch the small shifts, the twitch of a hand before a shot, the change in footfall that signaled a trap, the silence that preceded ambush. He didn't raise his eyes yet, but he listened more intently. And in listening, he heard the edges of the truth beginning to crack through. I need to verify one last thing," Cynthia murmured and disappeared into the back office with his paperwork. A few minutes passed. Then 5. Then 10. The waiting wasn't hard. Waiting was something Bobby had long since mastered. What was hard was the stillness, the way it gave room for his thoughts to move where he preferred they didn't. He remembered standing guard at midnight in Danong, the air soaked with the possibility of violence, every shadow a question mark. He remembered the slow unraveling of trust in his command, in the mission, in the meaning behind it all. And now, years later, in a quiet bank 1,000 miles and 4 decades from that memory, the same feeling was returning. The same doubt. The same weight. Cynthia returned, but not alone. Behind her came the branch manager again, different now. Shoulders slightly lower, eyes softened. He had a folder in his hands and a hint of unease around his mouth. Bobby watched him approach, slow and rehearsed, the way someone might approach a grave they once forgot to visit. "Mr. Keene," the manager began, "we've confirmed everything. There was a miss flag in our system. An old security protocol that shouldn't have been attached to your file. It triggered an unnecessary review." The word unnecessary hung there, too sterile to name what had just happened. Bobby said nothing. The manager hesitated, then opened the folder and laid it on the desk. Inside were documents, official, stamped, correct. Bobby's name, his service records, a small typed apology from corporate. But none of them were as important as the paper tucked just behind, a letter, hand-signed by a regional director, dated months ago, that acknowledged Bobby's identity and entitled him to expedited benefits. The same letter he had brought in twice before and been told was missing from their system. Now it wasn't. Now it was suddenly here. Cynthia looked shaken, and this time, she didn't hide it. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, and Bobby looked at her for the first time with something close to sorrow. Not for her, but for how young she looked in that moment. Not in age, but in understanding. She had never seen the inside of a battlefield. Never carried a body on her back while under fire. Never had to learn how to live again afterward. She had only ever lived in the aftermath, where wars were names in textbooks and veterans were names in databases. "I've been here before," Bobby said, and the sound of his voice startled even him. It was lower than usual, rough with something too tired to be anger. "Twice, actually. I brought this letter both times. And both times, I was told it didn't exist." The manager shifted. "It must have been buried." Bobby finished for him, voice calm but pointed. "Misfiled? Forgotten?" No one answered. Bobby closed the folder gently, methodically, like folding a flag. He didn't slam it or raise his voice. That would have made it easier for them. Anger would have been familiar, even justifiable. But restraint? That made them look deeper. And he wanted them to look. "You know," he said, "when I came back in '69, there wasn't a parade. We came through the back gate. No uniforms, no stories, no questions. Just move on. Make do. And most of us did." Cynthia's eyes welled a little. She didn't look away. But what people don't realize, Bobby continued, is that the war doesn't end just because you stop shooting. Sometimes it just moves. Into systems. Into assumptions. Into this. He tapped the folder once, lightly. No accusation. Just evidence. The manager nodded slowly, as if only now beginning to understand the magnitude of what had unfolded. You're right, he said. And we'll make this right. Bobby smiled faintly. Not because he believed them, but because he had stopped needing to. The truth, when it came, did not thunder down like judgment. It seeped in slowly, through the cracks in their voices, through the change in their eyes. And that was enough. Not redemption, but recognition. He stood, gathering his things without urgency. The challenge coin slipped back into his pocket, the folder under his arm. No dramatics. No demands. Just the quiet dignity of someone who had once been forgotten, but would not allow himself to disappear. As he walked past the waiting customers, some glanced up. Most didn't. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds for the first time that day, and Bobby, stepping into it, paused just for a moment. Not to bask in it, but to remember that even the smallest light, when held long enough, could reveal the truth in places long left in shadow. The next day passed like a breath held too long, tight in the chest, full of things unspoken. Bobby didn't tell anyone what happened at the bank. He didn't need to. The weight of it lingered in the way he moved around his house, slower than usual, but not with weakness. With care. As if the ground beneath him had shifted, and he wanted to feel every inch of it before taking another step. His phone rang just past 10. The number was unfamiliar, though the precision in the voice that answered it was not. Clipped. Military. The kind of tone that carried weight without ever needing to raise its volume. Mr. Keene, the voice said. This is Everett Kane. The name didn't hit right away. It rolled past Bobby's mind, circling something dormant, until it landed, hard. Kane. Not the name of a stranger. A name from another life. From a briefing room in Pleiku. From the edge of a chopper blade in the late monsoon. From the silence after a last order was given and carried out, long after the ones who gave it were gone. You've got time to meet? Kane asked, but it wasn't really a question. Men like Kane didn't ask. They announced a direction and waited to see who had the spine to walk it. Still, Bobby agreed. They met at a quiet diner off a back road near the edge of town. The kind of place that had once served pie to truckers and coffee to drifters, now reclaimed by silence and Formica. Kane arrived first. He always did. Bobby spotted him through the glass. Upright, uniform even in civilian clothes. Pressed shirt. Silver hair. Eyes that had once surveyed entire battalions and still saw too much. As Bobby walked in, Kane stood, not quickly, not ceremoniously, but like a man who still believed in protocol even when the world had forgotten its usefulness. Bobby, he said, and extended a hand. Bobby took it. Firm. Not a handshake. A reckoning. You're not easy to find, Kane said once they Saturday, but when the wrong people flag your file, the right people notice eventually. Bobby didn't answer. He looked at the man across from him and remembered the last time they had stood eye to eye. There had been sweat, blood, and a collapsed radio tower. There had been screams in the distance and a silence afterward that haunted him more than the noise. Kane took off his watch, laid it carefully beside his glass of water, then reached into a folder. Bobby tensed. Not out of fear. Out of expectation. Folders now made him cautious, symbols of bureaucracy, of systems designed to forget and pretend otherwise. But what Kane pulled out wasn't a letter. It was a photograph. Grainy. Old. Black and white. For men in jungle gear, crouched beside a Huey. One of them was Bobby. Another was Kane. The other two were ghosts. I thought this got lost, Bobby muttered. It was supposed to, Kane replied. Along with the mission. Along with everything we did in that valley. The words hung heavy between them. What happened at that bank, Kane continued, wasn't just a clerical error. It was a scar that got reopened. We've got too many of those, Bobby. Bobby exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but recognition. They thought I was a fraud.
Twice.
They looked me in the eye and couldn't see anything worth believing. They weren't trained to see you, Kane said. They were trained to see a number, a file, a threat profile. They didn't see the man who pulled half my squad out of a minefield in '68. Bobby looked down at the photo again. That man died a long time ago. No, Kane said, with more steel than sympathy. That man survived. That's what they never talk about. What survival costs. There was silence. Not the empty kind. The kind that held space for things too big to say all at once. I came because I want to make sure your name never disappears again, Kane said finally. There's a program. Quiet. For men like you.
For cases like this.
They'll call it an investigation. But what it really is correction. And I want you at the center of it. Bobby narrowed his eyes. Why now? Kane didn't flinch. Because the truth doesn't bury itself. People do. And when someone digs it up the right way, we owe it to the ones still underground to tell it straight. He slid another envelope across the table. No stamps. No corporate insignia. Handwritten. A personal request to testify, not before a court, but before a special panel. Military. Internal. Invisible to the public, but powerful enough to reroute policy. It wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about the pattern. They need to hear your story, Kane said. Not the combat version. The aftermath. The long war. Bobby hesitated, not because he didn't want to speak, but because he wasn't sure his story would matter to people who had never once asked for it. But then he remembered the bank. The way Cynthia's face changed. The silence that fell after the apology. The photograph now trembling slightly in his fingers. All right, he said. Kane nodded once. No thanks. Just acknowledgement. Between soldiers, that was enough. They sat for a while longer, not talking, just sharing the space between past and present. As they parted, Kane said something Bobby wouldn't forget. The mission changed, but the fight didn't. We're still out here. Still trying to make the country we came home to worth the one we fought for. Bobby walked out into the fading light, the envelope in his pocket, and the weight of memory wrapped around his shoulders like the old flak jacket he once buried in his garage. He didn't feel vindicated, but he did feel something else. Not hope. Resolve. The hearing wasn't what Bobby had expected. There were no cameras, no rows of flashing badges, or tight-jawed politicians leaning on patriotism for applause. Just a dimly lit room in a nondescript federal building, the kind where truths get filed between the cracks of forgotten wallpaper and recycled coffee. The walls were beige. The carpet was gray. The people inside, 7 in total, were dressed in variations of dark blue and tired eyes. They introduced themselves as a special committee under the Department of Defense's Veterans Oversight Initiative, a name so sanitized it barely hinted at the lives it affected. But Bobby could feel it in the air, the gravity, the history pressing against their collars. Everett Kane was there too, not seated among them, but standing silently along the wall, a figure of quiet authority, watching like a sentinel over something long buried. Bobby didn't have a prepared statement. He didn't want one. What he carried could not be rehearsed. He told them everything. About the letter from the bank. About the woman who looked through him like a pane of glass. About the freeze on his benefits. The audit that turned into suspicion. The suspicion that metastasized into humiliation. But most of all, he spoke of the silence. The 24 hours he had spent not as a man or a veteran, but as a question mark in a system that once sent him to war and then couldn't remember why. At first, the room remained still. The committee asked procedural questions, confirming dates, service numbers, assignment records. But as Bobby went deeper, into the jungle nights, the sound of rotors above fire, the faces of the dead who never made it back and the ones who did but never really returned, the air began to change. These were not bureaucrats now. They were witnesses. And Bobby didn't speak like a victim. He spoke like someone who had endured the quiet erosion of identity. Someone who had watched the country he fought for revise his existence with a clerical error and a shrug. When it ended, the chair of the panel, a woman named Dr. Ellen Sarter, with lines beneath her eyes like riverbeds, stood and walked toward him. Her expression wasn't official. It was personal. She held out a folder, stamped and signed. "Your full record has been restored," she said. "Every benefit reinstated retroactively. There will be a formal correction issued to all departments that flagged your file. The bank has already been notified. You'll receive a written apology." Bobby took the folder. Not because he needed proof, but because it meant someone had finally looked. Then came a pause. A moment suspended in the space between formality and something human. Dr. Sartor's voice softened. "Mr. Keene,
Bobby.
on behalf of the institution that failed you, I'm sorry. Not just for the mistake, for how long it took to see it, for the burden you carried alone." He didn't answer right away, because sorry was such a small word for such a long silence. But he nodded. "I appreciate that," he said, and he meant it. Not because the apology fixed everything, it didn't, but because it acknowledged what most men like him carried their whole lives without hearing, that the damage wasn't all done overseas. Later, outside the building, Kane caught up with him on the sidewalk. The sun was low, gold and merciful, like a second chance, warming the pavement. "They listened," Bobby said, more to himself than to Kane. "They did," Kane replied. "That's not everything, but it's something." Bobby looked up at the sky. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel healed, but he felt seen. And for the first time in years, he wasn't carrying it all by himself. Back home, he placed the folder in the same drawer where he had once kept his discharge papers. He didn't need to read it again. The words weren't what mattered now. It was the fact that they were finally written. Then he sat in his chair by the window, the sun fading behind the trees, his hand resting on the armrest, not clenched, not tight, just open. That night, he slept without waking once. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, printed on thick, ivory paper with the seal of the Department of Defense embossed in gold at the top. Bobby didn't open it right away. He sat at the kitchen table, fingers grazing the edge of the envelope, as if the weight of its contents could seep through paper. His coffee had long gone cold. The house was silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the creak of old wood settling into its age. When he finally broke the seal, he didn't read it aloud. He let the words sink in slowly, absorbing them like rain into dry earth. "In acknowledgement of your service, integrity, and the wrongful administrative action that temporarily distorted your record, the Department of Defense extends its deepest regret. In recognition of your contributions to the security and ideals of this nation, your name and record have been publicly restored with honor." There were more words about duty, patriotism, sacrifice, but Bobby stopped reading. Not out of resentment. He had heard those words before, usually spoken at funerals or political rallies. But today they felt different. Not because they were finally addressed to him, but because they had been earned again, not on a battlefield, but through silence, dignity, and truth. A week later, the letter was followed by something unexpected, an invitation. The ceremony was to be held at Fort Meade, a formal recognition event. Small, by military standards. Closed to press. No cameras. Just a room filled with quiet acknowledgement, overdue gestures, and men who had once been names in forgotten folders. It wasn't about medals or speeches. It was about something simpler, being seen. Bobby didn't own a dress uniform anymore. He had left most of that life behind in a storage box in a different state, a different decade. But Kane had made arrangements. A crisp set of dress blues was delivered to his door, perfectly tailored, the ribbons placed exactly where they had once been. Bobby held the jacket in his hands like it was something fragile. It smelled like starch and formality, and a little like memory. The day of the ceremony, the sky was overcast, but bright. Not a mournful gray, more like a quiet canvas. Bobby stood among a dozen other veterans, each with their own private war, their own silent weight. Some were younger, some older. All had been overlooked, misfiled, questioned. And now, one by one, they were called to the front, not to be congratulated, but to be corrected. When Bobby's name was spoken into the microphone, Robert Charles Keene, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, 3rd Recon Division, there was a pause. as if even the speaker knew the weight behind those syllables. Bobby stepped forward, his gait steady, deliberate. As he approached the podium, Everett Kane stood waiting. Their eyes met, no salute, no formality, just a look that said, "You made it here." Kane pinned his small insignia onto Bobby's lapel. It wasn't an award. It was a symbol of restored status, a visual mark that his record had not only been corrected, but affirmed. There were no cameras to catch the moment, but Bobby didn't care. He wasn't there to be seen by the world. He was there to see himself again. A few words were said, brief, respectful. Kane didn't give a speech. Instead, he offered a quote from a letter Bobby had written during his second tour. "We don't fight for medals. We fight to come home knowing we did what was right, even if no one ever knows it." And that was it. No parade. No fireworks. Just a room that stood in silence for a few moments longer than it needed to, because sometimes silence is the only way to truly measure respect. Afterward, Bobby walked alone for a while outside the base. The air was cool, the grass freshly trimmed. Somewhere in the distance, a flag rose slowly on a pole, its fabric cracking softly in the wind. He stood there for a long while, hands in his pockets, staring at the red, white, and blue. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a relic. He felt aligned, like the world, in its slow, clumsy way, had turned to face him again. That night, back home, he placed the insignia not on a shelf, but inside his old duffel bag. It wasn't for display. It wasn't for show. It was part of the journey now. Something carried, not worn. And when he looked in the mirror before bed, he saw himself, not the man the system forgot, but the one who remembered who he was, even when no one else did. And that was honor. Not given. Not restored. Reclaimed. Bobby never told many people about the ceremony. There was no social media post, no phone call to distant relatives. Even the neighbors, who often saw him walking his dog in the early mornings, wouldn't have noticed anything different. The world hadn't changed. Not really. And that was the part he understood best now. Redemption, for all its weight and meaning, doesn't always echo. Sometimes, it simply settles into the bones, like warmth returning to numb fingers. Life continued. The morning still started with the quiet grind of coffee. The air still smelled faintly of pine outside his porch. The same old chair by the window welcomed him each evening as he sat, book in lap, radio low. But something had shifted, not in what he did, but in how he carried it all. There was peace now, not the loud, victorious kind, but the sort that fills silence with something solid. It didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the years lost or the questions that had haunted him. But it gave them form, a place to rest, like stones finally laid in the right corner of a foundation. He received a few letters after the event. One from an old teammate, just a sentence or two, but it was enough. Another from a junior officer he once mentored, now retired. A simple note. "You taught me what right looked like." Glad the world caught up. Bobby kept them in a drawer, never reread them. He didn't need to. He never went back to the base again. Never felt the need to revisit that moment. The insignia stayed in the duffel bag. The corrected records remained unread in a folder at the bottom of a filing cabinet. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he finally didn't have to. One evening, as the sun was folding itself into the horizon, Bobby stood at the edge of his small backyard. The wind rolled in softly, rustling the leaves in a way that reminded him of jungle patrols, of radios clicking quietly under camouflage netting, of the deep, wordless knowing you shared with brothers in arms under foreign skies. He closed his eyes. Not in mourning, not in memory, just in presence, in breath. In that moment, there was no need for validation, no echo of injustice or vindication, just the hum of life around him. A breeze, the distant bark of a dog, the faint scent of cut grass and old leather. Things he had once taken for granted, now held like treasures. He turned and walked inside, turning off the porch light behind him. No grand statements. No declarations. Just the door clicking softly closed behind him. A man, once buried in silence, now content in it. And that was the ending. Not triumphant, not tragic, but quiet. And in its quietness, unshakably whole.